emphasis on line work, or the manipulation of the outline of the character versus shading to show depth perception. And I also use this image as an example of how ukiyo-e, or woodblock printing, was considered a comparatively lowbrow form of expression. Now, when we say lowbrow in the West, it means it's somehow less sophisticated in technique. That is not what is meant when I'm talking about the Japanese art form. What it means is that you can afford to be, or you in some ways encouraged to be, a little risque, or a little bawdy. So you can see in the opening of the robe there, this is essentially a topless image of a woman in a yukata, or light summer robe. And the outlines there are really what captivate the eye. Not the shading, not the sense of depths and hollows, but the outline there of her bun and of the robe itself. And this is intensely pronounced in probably one of the most famous ukiyo-e prints of the Great Wave. And I mentioned the cloud earlier, but I still find this astonishing every time I see it, but the almost clutching fingers of the foam of the wave, and how your eye is riven to that sense of power, but also, I would say, that sense of animation, that sense of animism, of movement and kinetic movement in the image that is done almost exclusively through line work. So, to compare a couple of classic comic images, here we have the archetypal shot of Superman soaring over the city, and wonderfully illustrated, by the way, but so much of, especially the character's body, is conveyed, and its energy is conveyed through shading, to show you the musculature of Clark Kent when he's out of his suit and in his Superman suit. The extraordinary work in the hollows of the neck, which I think is really intense. And you have an American artist here going after a kind of hyper-realism or hyper-naturalism with the image of Clark Kent. It's still, of course, an illustrated image, and necessarily so, but the attempt here is to create what I would say is a kind of hyper-realism. If you actually took a photo of Superman in this position above the city, you wouldn't have all of these details in the photograph, right? So it's kind of hyper-real. The muscles are sort of, they all have their form and their intensity because this has been illustrated. This is not a photograph. Well, and admittedly this is a huge leap, but here we have one of the most famous characters in Japanese popular culture imagery. This is Pikachu, I mentioned earlier, from the Pokemon series. This is the character that is now in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade each year, soaring above Fifth Avenue. And I just want to draw your attention very quickly to, again, the emphasis here being on the outline of the character, the shapes of the character through line work, as opposed to any sense of depth perception. It's all outlining, and I could go all evening with examples and so on, but these are obviously extreme examples, but just to illustrate my point here, if you open a manga or you look at an anime, more often than not what you're appreciating is the manipulation of outlines. And in fact, when I interviewed the producers of Pokemon and the artists behind Pokemon in my book, one of the things they reiterated is that we're always trying to come up with a character that you could recognize immediately in silhouette. Even if you never saw the actual face of the character, or the character's eyes or nose or mouth, we want you to be able to recognize the silhouette of the character, the outline of the character, and for that to make a mark on the imagination. And it's worth mentioning here a character who's not technically an anime character, but is also very much an icon of Japanese pop culture, and that is Hello Kitty, as she's called over here, or Kitty-chan, which its creators tell me in the book their mantra is roughly 17 lines to create the face, and no mouth. So in many respects, it's a minimalistic aesthetic approach, especially compared with the archetypal American approach to cartooning, which again is often hyper-realistic. There are, of course, exceptions, and here I want to mention a character very popular in Japan, which is Snoopy. And I think one of the reasons Snoopy is so beloved in Japan is that it's very much a line-drawn comic, recognizable in silhouette immediately. You know, if you see a silhouette of Snoopy, you know it's Snoopy and no other dog. And also fairly minimalistic. And I tried to address this in the book with respect to other more traditional Japanese aesthetics. If you think of the haiku poem, the traditional Japanese poem, the white space around the poem is meant to be as eloquent and meaningful as the very minimalistic lines of the poem itself. If any of you have seen Ikebana, or the art of flower arrangement in Japan, there's nothing like a bouquet of roses or tulips. Ikebana is about the spaces between the stems of the flowers themselves and how those spaces are manipulated and the leanness of the imagery itself. It's not meant to be garish or maximalistic. I think you can, well, the other example I often speak of is No Theater. I don't know, how many of you know what No N-O-H theater is? If you've ever been to see No Theater, and you're not a specialist in No Theater, it can be a challenge. And that's partly because it's supremely minimalistic. It's the art of very little movement on the stage. And most of the dialogue or vocal expression is done in chanting form. So it's almost like looking at the stage and trying to follow the story with very, very little movement whatsoever. So all of these aesthetics, dating back centuries, involve using very little to achieve a lot, or at least that's the ideal, to achieve more with less. And I think one way of looking at the arts of anime and manga is that that's what, in many cases, they set out to achieve. Which is not to say that you won't find tremendous details in the illustrations of Miyazaki Hayao or many other manga artists. But very often the characters and the mainframes that you're looking at are very simply and yet eloquently drawn. And the outline is very much the key aesthetic, the key aesthetic form that's being manipulated, as opposed to shading and depth perception. Finally, just as a wrap up before we have some questions, I mentioned earlier that somebody had asked whether many Japanese actually speak English or read and write in English, and relatively speaking, no, not very many do. And this absence of a sense of global presence. Japan remains, in many respects, quite a provincial population. It's an island nation, of course, but it's also, comparatively speaking, quite inward-looking. And this is ironic, but I think if any of you have been to Japan, or if you go to Japan, the number of programs, offices, strategies that are called international is almost a dead giveaway. You'll get out of a train station, it'll say the International Shopping Center, the International Game Center, and of course there's nothing international about it, and very few signs are in English, etc. But there's almost a self-consciousness about being international that I would say belies the fact that internationalism has not really taken root in Japan in many respects, which again, I want to be very careful not to generalize in the way that one does in a speech. There are many Japanese who travel all over the world. There are many Japanese who do business all over the world, so I'm not speaking for the entire nation. But when you're talking about pop musicians, I think you said Sweden, who are writing songs in English, that's very unusual in Japan. Consequently, the anime industry in particular has done a very, thus far, poor job capitalizing